I was thinking about the specific brief of talking to this issue of sustainable, equitable urban transformations, not transitions, and also to show my cards, also to sort of put some ideas on the table for something that we're planning to work on as a project. Sam asked us to think about, basically how and what are sustainable urban equitable transformations, or transitions, I've done it, and what can be done with them. So I sort of parsed that question up a bit to ask, first of all, what is specifically urban about any of this that I'm going to be talking about? And then secondly, what do we mean by transitions? And then last but by no means least, where does sustainability and equity come into all of it? And I also have possible, so I could speak very much longer, but I want to be brief. I may go on too long anyway. So the approach that I'm developing in collaboration with Adrian and Sam on our existing project, from which this little green thing at the bottom is the sign, is looking. It's similar to the Pathways approach. It's, I think, slightly different though as well. So again, similar sets of terms there: systems, power, and innovation, and I'm interested in thinking about studying questions of transition or socio-technical systems more generally as dynamic, complex power knowledge systems. And I just want to explain what I mean by each of those. And again, also, where the goal of this kind of research is impact, not in terms of being able to say there's impact in our ESRC return, but in terms of actually making a difference to what it is that we're studying. So what do I mean by complex? I don't mean complicated, and I don't mean that it involves lots of things which are impossible to know at the same time. I mean specifically systems that are non-linear, that can therefore give rise to emergence, and that do involve multi-factors as a result. So a great deal of contingency in there as well. They're also dynamic, not just in terms of there's a lot of activity, but they're dynamic in the fact that they don't achieve equilibrium. They don't reach a point of stasis. They are at most metastable, where the processes of the dynamic processes have reached some kind of feedback loops which keep the process in homeostasis. And then finally, in terms of power knowledge, by this I mean that these systems are constituted by power knowledge relations and technologies. They are not merely dominated by them. And therefore the language of power is not one that is always bad. To the contrary, if we're trying to actually construct alternative pathways, we actually want to have some grasp on whatever power means. And the flip side of this is that narratives and knowledge and truths are all very important, but they are in fact made. And they are made in processes that enable some and tend to disable others. And finally, all of this is in concrete. It's always incomplete, and it's always specific. So it's very nice that we can set out an abstract picture, but in fact, if we're going to add any flesh to this, and in fact even understand the terms themselves, we need to talk about specific examples. So this is just the rough picture. It's very schematic, and it leaves a lot out, as I increasingly see. But the idea is that on the one hand we have these power relations and technologies, and on the other we have strategic agencies and practices. One conditions the other and vice versa, with research and innovation as a very specific form of agency and practice which directly forms new power knowledge technologies. And in the case of locked-in systems, we have positive feedbacks, which are what is exactly reinstituting the lock-in. But similarly, for processes of transition, we have emergent dynamics going round and round and generating some forms of positive feedback. So that's the basic picture. If we then turn to my first question then of what are urban systems, and this is, I think, to be upfront, where I'm being most experimental. Cities are archetypal complex systems, so they are absolutely related to what I was just talking about. But they are not just any kind of, we can't just talk about them in general. They're not, the brain is a complex system. They are not brains, they are not bodies, they are not ecologies, they're cities. What are they? The theorist Levy, he talks about cities as the meeting of density and diversity. So the city is both material and objective. It can be studied, therefore, with rather quantitative methods, but they're also profoundly human and affective. Vincent Kaufmann talks about three aspects of cities, therefore. They're characterized by a functional centrality in terms of their influence on suburbs. They have an architectural morphology which is specific, that is their density, and the particular form of buildings and infrastructures that make up cities. That means you know when you're in a city. And of course they're associated with particular lifestyles, specific social practices, experiences and subjectivities. So on the one hand we have the density, the morphology and the urban form, but we also have the diversity. And if you ask people who live in cities or who aspire to live in cities, what is a city to you? They say a city is where things happen. They say a city is my home in the world, and where both of those terms deserve emphasis. Because it's an extraordinary mix, home in the world. The city is both your neighborhood and yet somewhere where you can be anonymous and encounter a stranger. And both of those are crucially important to the nature of cities, the attraction of cities, why people move to cities, why cities are growing around the world. And they are a place of the good life as well, whatever that means, that is, to which people again choose to move. I put choose in inverted commas because many people choose to move out of necessity, so what does that choose mean? But nevertheless, what the good life is and what the city offers actually is a place in which multiple definitions of good life can actually be in the same place. So one of the things that this immediately rules out is for a plannedness of the city, because that is always going to privilege an arbitrary definition of the good life. Another incredibly important element of the urban, and obviously I'm wearing my flag here as a mobility scholar, is the importance of mobility generally to what the urban form is, what a city is. Mobility is crucial to cities as complex systems. Cities cannot function without circulation, for starters. But mobility here is not just movement. It is movement both spatial and social. We talk about mobility as social mobility as well, implying a change in the actor's state. And again, this captures both the physical and the social subjective aspects of what I was saying about cities. So the city, what in the end can we define, a working definition of the city is, it's the confluence of an actor's mobility capacities, their ability for movement that implies a change in their state, and of the space's receptiveness to those mobility projects. So I mean, again, our projects in order to get around the city, but our projects also of what is going to happen in the course of our lives. And in which these two are in turn co-produced. The actor's mobility, their capacities, their subjectivities are co-produced with what the city has to offer to them. And of course, finally, in coming back to our key question about sustainable and equitable transformations, both of these are key aspects of urban inequalities. So the ability of the capacities for mobility are differentially spread amongst individual people, and similarly the space's receptiveness to specific forms of mobility projects are equally diverse and unequal. So, and then finally, all of this is through them being conceived as power-knowledge relations. These are also systems of government of ongoing urban socio-technical change, resilience, etc. So I want to use the example of extremely brief about this, I'm afraid. What is the car? The car is the industry of industries. It's a site of major innovations. It's the paradigm globalized industry. And even as it's been extremely hard hit by the economic crisis, with GM, for instance, going into bankruptcy, it remains the case that automobility is absolutely at the center of policy imaginations about what the future of moving around the city involves. Automobility as a system, though, is not just about the car. It's automobile use in everything that makes it possible, which in turn means not just other infrastructures, roads, petrol stations or charging stations, as I'll talk about in a minute, but also all the effective and personal investments put into cars. So again, we come back to this idea that mobility is a socio-technical system, and it's extremely locked in, perhaps the hardest case. We can just about imagine China getting off coal in the future, somewhere in the future, into renewables. Because that process is in train already. But to take China or Britain or the US off the car is absolutely, extraordinarily difficult to imagine. So we have system lock-in. We want to break out with transition. And this is just my opportunity to say very briefly that the way in which this is being approached in China is with the electric vehicle as a major opportunity. The internal combustion engine automotive majors are sewn up, and they are so far in the lead that catch-up seems an impossibility, even while they are working in joint ventures with Chinese companies. On the other hand, the electric vehicle is a new technology. Perhaps this is the opportunity to overtake round the corner, as it's been called. One might expect, therefore, with a very aggressive industrial policy behind this, in a country such as China, that there would be EVs evidently on the roads, and yet we don't see that. So how can we break car lock-in? I want to say that, talk about this very, I will skip the second point altogether, by just to say that the answer to these questions is in three steps. One is in terms of who can break the car lock-in? And my answer to that question is in terms of China, is in fact forming a broad coalition of electric vehicle, I'm putting those in scare quotes for reasons you'll see, or rather just e-mobility transition forces that gathers that systemic momentum, which is greater, and it's in competition, we must see that. It's in competition with the internal combustion engine car. This in turn is built around an emerging vision of new urban e-mobility systems that is increasingly both realistic, that is rigorous, technologically up to date, etc., and compelling both to industry and to consumers. And then finally, and formed around and manifest in diverse practices of mobility, not just transport, and a future scenario of diverse transport options and therefore cities, not simple replacement of one engine by another engine. So take those in reverse order. Let's see how, first of all. How and where is the car? How do we generate a system breaking or forming momentum? And this, I guess, is the sustainable aspect of all of this. How do we get a sustainable mobility system? The first point is to see that there are some singular social and cultural barriers to the EV in China, elsewhere as well, but I've been looking at China. Number one of this is that there is no consumer desire whatsoever for the electric vehicle in China. All the vehicles that have been sold, with exceptions we shall see in a minute, are basically through local government procurement to taxi companies. And so you may be very familiar with this famous quotation from a sort of an X Factor contestant in China who said she would rather cry in the back of a BMW than laugh on the back of a bicycle. And of course there's this other joke, it's a joke which we can say in English, but BMW means be my wife. So what does this talk about? It says that the consumer desire for the big German car remains absolutely overwhelming. It's also sedimented. It's sedimented in social practices, not just of social status, but also of demand for mobility. What is making you move around? The shopping, the commute, the school run. Your commute is even if it takes you a long time, it's going to be something that you might even get something out of to the extent that you are sat in the traffic in a BMW. Another important aspect of it. And then, of course, it's built into new urban infrastructures to the extent that these are common sense and therefore are rebuilt as common sense. We have this positive feedback loop. So the first thing that the EV must be, whatever the EV is, and that's another discussion altogether, is it must be a hugely attractive consumer item. So demand is crucial to success for mobility transitions, and therefore the specific form of that demand is inseparable from the urban model. So the mobility projects, it conditions and privileges, and the specific system receptiveness and individual capacities. This model is in turn co-produced with a specific configuration of power-knowledge relations that are characteristic of that specific city. And each city is different. Three aspects to this, very crudely. In China, what are the state priorities, by which I mean both local and national government? In China, the priority is very clearly about a modern car-based city. So, of course, that is exactly what is being produced. Secondly, in terms of private market power, and of course this also involves global market power, what does that take the form of in China? It takes very much the form of consumer aspiration. And then finally, in terms of other stakeholders in public sphere or civil society, it is actually overwhelmingly pro-car. One of the most important movements around mobility are not for the bicycle or for greening the car, certainly not for the electric vehicle. It's about things like parking, parking, a very important issue. So what does attractive mean if you add all these together? You have something like this. You have a Tesla, or you have a BMW, right? In other words, cars, right? Just electric cars. So what does this mean? They are highly elite, they have low market penetration at best, and of course they have absolutely no effect whatsoever on congestion or the whole range of complex problems to do with mobility. So, how else could it be done? Could it be approached? To the extent that we know what the EV is, and I said that I could say more about that, but I won't, the EV must be seen not as a car with an electric engine. It must be somehow seen as an icon of new livable urban modernity. So attractive here most credibly means the development of I realized, having read these slides, that I wrote this without even thinking, a new normal of urban quality of life. That is a new system of urban mobility, that not just about transport technology. And the EV's prospects, therefore, hinge on building a credible consumer pitch that links the EV inseparably in the public imagination with a broader shift to highly desirable but widely available forms of urban life. So the EV is here, therefore, one amongst several mobility options. It isn't just one, and a crucial part of an urban mobility transition in which the EV is integrated, and it's inseparably only one of multiple technological changes to whatever the car itself happens to end up being. There are also very important socio-political trends in China for that process, not for the shift to the electric car. So we have all these pressures here, the growth of whatever the middle class means, that's another question, of course, too. Mobility as itself, an area of intense but changing identity politics. So there are generational changes, of course, within China as well. And not least important is the digitization of mobility. Finally, therefore, who is the EV? It's in competition with the incumbent internal combustion engine system. The EV prospects hinge on emergence or even formation of a broad e-mobility coalition that doesn't just involve those who care about the electric car. It has to also be built around people-oriented mobility system advocates beyond the EV, so for instance the electric bike would be a very important aspect of that in China. And even those who have no interest whatsoever in vehicle or transport technologies. Those who work on ICTs or smart grids or urban design. And this might therefore dynamically and responsively construct a viable vision of post-internal combustion engine urban mobility working towards its realization. So therefore, Sam asked us to think about some research questions. I just want to end on that note. He asked us how and what are sustainable urban transitions. I want to say we don't know. That's the starting point, right? We don't know, and more to the point, it's not for us to decide and then to tell everybody what an urban transition looks like. Because I've said that if we accept that these systems are complex, then they are specific, and they should be participatory. So that's the way it should proceed. The goal, therefore, is to assist formulation of credible, and I'm using momentum as an adjective here, that is effectively powerful imaginaries of modern mobility and the city. And so my questions would be, to the extent that what I've described might be emerging, who does this emerging discourse, innovation, or movements of system transition to livable urban modernity in China enable and disable? We need to look at both sides and how. We also then need to ask whose projects of mobility, whose aspirations in moving to this city are enabled or disabled, whose are made obviously common sense and universal, and whose are discounted and how. And then finally, taking us back to some elements of the pathways approach, what gaps emerge in that process, what innovations, both socio-technical but also discursive and cultural and political and social and institutional, could enable the alternatives also to have a say in the future of urban China. Okay, thank you very much.